Auctioned as a breeder again, the Omega's wrist carried the dead Luna's name tied to the Alpha King. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Elena Brooks stood at the center of a cold, dimly lit auction hall, the murmur of the crowd vibrating in the air around her. Her wrists were bound with chains, but her mind was far from the physical restraint. She had been sold countless times before, each time a different set of eyes, a different set of expectations. Today, she was being auctioned again, not as a woman, but as an Omega, a commodity, a breeder. She had no say in the matter. Her fate had always been decided by others, her life dictated by a system that viewed her as nothing more than a tool for reproduction. The large iron doors at the back of the hall creaked open, and a heavy silence fell over the room. Elena barely glanced up, though she knew what was coming. The Alpha King himself was about to enter. The man who ruled over all the Alphas, the one whose name sent shivers down the spines of even the bravest of his subjects. Lucas Montgomery. He was a force of nature, untouchable, relentless. His eyes swept the room, cold and calculating, before they landed on Elena. She didn't flinch, but she felt his gaze like a weight pressing down on her chest. Her wrist, adorned with a mark of Luna's name, burned under his scrutiny. It was a reminder of what she had lost and what had been forced upon her. Luna, the former Luna, the Alpha King's deceased wife. The mark on Elena's wrist had been made by the very woman before her death, a name that now haunted her every waking moment. The crowd parted, and Elena found herself staring into the eyes of the Alpha King. For a brief moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something, regret, perhaps, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by the cold, indifferent mask he wore. As the bidding started, Elena's heart raced, not because she feared being sold, but because she couldn't shake the feeling that this auction might change everything. Something in the air was different today. Something that made her wonder if the Alpha King was about to alter her destiny, whether he knew it or not. Elena had always been told what to do, who to be. But the chains that held her in place weren't just around her wrists. They were around her very soul. This time, she couldn't help but feel that this auction, like the others, would push her closer to a future she never asked for, yet somehow couldn't avoid. And as the bidding continued, the Omega's wrist, marked by the name of the dead Luna, seemed to pulse with a power of its own, one that no one, not even the Alpha King, could predict. The bidding continued, each offer a harsh reminder of Elena's place in the world. As the voices grew louder, her mind raced. She had been here before, standing in this very hall, offering herself as an object to be claimed. The cold, unforgiving atmosphere was suffocating. She had grown numb to the harshness of it all, but today something felt different. She couldn't explain it, but there was a heaviness in the air, as if fate was stirring something deeper within her. Alpha King Lucas Montgomery remained a silent figure, his gaze unwavering as he watched the bids rise. He had seen countless Omega auctions in his reign, but something about Elena made him uneasy. It wasn't just her beauty, though she was undeniably striking, but the mark on her wrist. The name of Luna, his late wife, still burned into the skin of this young woman who had been caught in the web of his kingdom's cruel customs. Lucas had never truly believed in the concept of fate, but now, standing before this woman, he was beginning to question everything. The name Luna, once a source of pride, now felt like a chain, a link that tied him to the past, to the grief he had never fully healed from. He had ruled with strength, with authority, but at what cost? The weight of his crown, the burden of leadership, was heavy on his shoulders. Elena's presence was like a mirror reflecting the emptiness he had long buried. He could see the pain in her eyes, a pain that mirrored his own, but unlike him, she had never been allowed to grieve. She had never been given the luxury of mourning. As the auctioneer called for the final bids, Lucas felt an unfamiliar pull inside him. Elena was more than just an Omega. She was a living reminder of everything he had lost. But that was the problem, wasn't it? He had built his life around control, around power. He had convinced himself that his past, his feelings, no longer mattered. But now, with her standing before him, he realized how hollow that belief was. The final bid rang out, and the room fell silent. Lucas's decision had been made. The crowd parted as he stepped forward, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. Without a word, he extended his hand to Elena, signaling for her to come to him. Elena hesitated, her body tense as if bracing for the inevitable. She had been sold to an alpha before, but none of them had ever looked at her the way Lucas did. His eyes were not filled with the usual coldness she had come to expect from the men who bought her. There was something else, something unspoken, lurking beneath the surface. The chain around her wrist felt heavier now, a symbol of the past she could never escape. But as she took a step toward him, something inside her shifted. For the first time in a long while, she wondered if her fate might not be sealed after all. Maybe there was a way to change it. Maybe, just maybe, she could find freedom in a world that had never given her the chance to choose. She reached out and placed her hand in his, the weight of the moment settling between them. The Alpha King's grip was firm, but not unkind. His eyes met hers, and for a fleeting moment, the world seemed to stand still. In that silence, Elena felt the weight of history, of Luna's name, of everything that had led her to this point. But she also felt something else, an undeniable pull, an unspoken promise that her story was far from over. Elena's hand lingered in Lucas's, her fingers trembling slightly as she felt the weight of the moment. The room was still, the air thick with unspoken words. For the first time in her life, she was no longer just a pawn in a game. She wasn't sure whether it was the gravity of her decision, the unfamiliar gentleness in Lucas's grip, or the hope that something, anything, might change, but she felt a stir of emotions inside her. It wasn't the usual feeling of helplessness that had always consumed her, but something different, something that felt like a whisper of freedom, faint yet undeniable. Lucas's eyes never left hers as he led her out of the auction hall, the clatter of footsteps and hushed murmurs following them like a distant echo. His pace was steady, unwavering, yet there was a subtle tension in the way he held her hand. Elena's heart raced as they passed through the grand marble halls, the walls lined with portraits of long-dead rulers, and the lingering scent of wealth and power in the air. She had always felt like an outsider in this world, a world where she didn't belong, a world that had never cared for her. But as they walked through the palace's grand corridors, she couldn't help but feel a strange, unsettling sense of being pulled into something much bigger than herself. The Alpha King's presence was commanding, yet there was something vulnerable beneath his controlled exterior, something that made Elena wonder if she had misjudged him. Was there more to Lucas Montgomery than the cold, unyielding ruler she had imagined? Or was he just another man playing his part in a world that didn't care for the weak, the powerless, the Omegas? As they reached a large door at the end of the hallway, Lucas paused. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You're not what I expected," he said, his voice low, almost thoughtful. Elena met his gaze, her own eyes narrowing slightly. She had always been a subject to be controlled, a being to be owned. She wasn't sure what he meant by his words, but she was not about to let her guard down. "What did you expect?" she asked, her voice steady despite the uncertainty swirling inside her. Lucas's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "I don't know," he admitted. "But you're different. I can see it in your eyes." Elena's heart skipped a beat at his words. Was he implying something? Was there more to this than just a transaction? "Don't mistake me for someone who will bow to you," she replied, her voice firm. "I'm not here to be a pawn in your game." For a moment, Lucas said nothing, his expression unreadable as he studied her. Elena braced herself for the usual response, a harsh reprimand, perhaps a reminder of who she was in his world. But instead, he simply nodded. "Fair enough," he said, his tone even. "But understand this, Elena. You're not alone here, and I don't plan to treat you as such." His words hung in the air, and for the first time, Elena wondered if there might be more to this arrangement than she had initially thought. What was he really offering her? And what did it mean for her future? She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, like he was trying to figure her out, to understand who she truly was beneath the mark of Luna, beneath the chains that had bound her all her life. Elena's mind raced, but she knew one thing for sure. Whatever lay ahead, she was no longer just a helpless pawn in a game. The rules had changed, and she wasn't about to let anyone dictate her fate again. Elena stood in the grand chamber, the heavy door closing behind her with a soft thud. She could feel the weight of the Alpha King's presence, not just physically, but in every corner of the room. The walls were adorned with lavish tapestries, symbols of power and legacy, reminders of a kingdom built on the backs of the weak, the powerless. She glanced at Lucas, who had stepped aside to let her enter, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken tension. Elena had expected harshness, expecting to be treated like another possession, something to be controlled. But the room, despite its grandeur, felt strangely devoid of the coldness she had anticipated. She turned to face him. "What now?" she asked, her voice steady, though a knot tightened in her stomach. Lucas's eyes met hers, and for the first time since they had met, she saw something flicker beneath the surface, something like curiosity. "Now," he said slowly, his tone thoughtful, "we figure out what to do with you." The words hung in the air, ambiguous and heavy. Elena didn't know whether to feel relief or unease. She had never been offered a choice before. There had always been a set path, a preordained role for her to play. But now, for the first time, she was being offered something else, something unknown. "And what exactly is that?" she asked, crossing her arms over her chest, wary of whatever game he might be playing. Lucas studied her for a long moment, as though weighing his words. "I'm not going to make you a prisoner," he said finally, his voice soft but firm. "I don't believe in treating people like that, even if society expects me to. You're not just some breeder, Elena. You're more than that." Elena blinked in surprise. Was this some kind of trick? She had been raised to believe that Omegas were nothing more than tools, their worth defined by their ability to serve the Alpha's needs. But Lucas's words, however sincere they seemed, felt like an illusion. "You don't know what it's like," she said bitterly, her voice trembling with suppressed anger. "You don't know what it's like to be bought, to be treated like an object." Lucas's expression softened, and he stepped closer, though he didn't touch her. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know what it's like to lose someone, to carry a weight that never goes away." His voice was quiet, raw, and for the first time, Elena saw the cracks in his facade. The Alpha King, the ruler who had held his kingdom in an iron grip, had vulnerabilities. He was more than the cold, distant ruler she had imagined. "What do you want from me?" Elena asked, the question hanging between them. She wasn't sure what kind of answer she expected, but she needed to know if there was any truth to the words he had spoken. "I want to understand you," Lucas said simply. "I want to know who you are beneath all of this." Elena frowned, unsure of what to make of his response. She had never had anyone genuinely interested in her as a person. In her world, she had always been seen as a thing, something to be used, something to be controlled. "I don't know if that's possible," she said, her voice low. "I've been shaped by this world, by everything I've had to endure. I don't know how to let that go." Lucas nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. "I can't promise that I'll make everything right," he said. "But I can. Promise that I won't treat you like a pawn. Not anymore." The weight of his words settled over her, and for a moment, Elena didn't know what to think. Could she trust him? Was there a part of her that could be free, despite the chains that had bound her for so long? She wasn't sure, but for the first time in her life, she felt something that resembled hope. Something fragile, but real. "We'll see," she said quietly, her gaze steady. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't finished yet. Elena sat at the edge of the grand table in Lucas's private chamber, her fingers tracing the rim of the goblet in front of her. The silence between them was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came with understanding, even if unspoken. Lucas had said he wouldn't treat her like a pawn, but part of her still wondered what his true intentions were. Could she really trust him? Could she trust anyone in this world? She had been hurt before, betrayed by those who had promised her freedom, only to imprison her in different ways. And yet, something about Lucas's presence was different. His words were not those of a man trying to control her, but of someone who was, perhaps, as lost as she was. "Tell me about Luna," Elena said suddenly, breaking the silence. She hadn't meant to bring up the topic, but the question had been nagging at her for days. The name on her wrist, the name that had haunted her since her arrival in the palace, was the same as the Alpha King's late wife. Lucas's eyes softened for a moment, and Elena saw the mask he wore slip, just for a second. He didn't respond right away, his gaze drifting to the large window that looked out over the vast estate. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Luna was everything. Lucas began, his voice quiet but steady. She was my anchor, my partner. We ruled together, and she was the heart of this kingdom. Elena's heart twisted at the emotion in his voice. She had never heard him speak with such vulnerability before. But she's gone, he continued, his gaze distant. And now, I'm not sure how to move forward. Not without her. Elena shifted in her seat, trying to process his words. She had always known that Luna's death had affected him deeply, but she hadn't realized just how much. And now you're trying to replace her with me? Elena asked, her voice a mix of bitterness and disbelief. Lucas's eyes snapped back to hers, and for the first time, she saw something akin to regret in them. No, he said firmly. I'm not trying to replace her. I would never expect anyone to fill her place. His words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. But the truth is, Elena, I am lost. I don't know how to lead without her. I don't know how to do this alone. Elena didn't know what to say. She could see the weight of his words, the vulnerability in them, but she couldn't ignore the fact that she had been brought here as a means to an end. She had been sold, auctioned like an object, and now she was sitting in a room with the very man who had helped create this system. Could he really change? Could he really see her as more than just an Omega? And what about me? Elena finally asked, her voice small but determined. What am I to you, Lucas? His gaze softened again, and he leaned forward slightly, his tone gentle but earnest. You're not just an Omega, he said. You're a person with a past, a story that deserves to be heard. Elena's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected those words. No one had ever said something like that to her before. She had always been defined by what she was, not who she was. I don't know what the future holds, Lucas continued, his voice steady. But I want to understand you. I want to help you find your place in this world, if you'll let me. Elena didn't know how to respond. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust him, but after everything she had been through, it was hard. Still, for the first time in a long time, she felt the faintest glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. Maybe she wasn't as powerless as she had always believed. The thought both frightened and excited her. I'll think about it, she said quietly, her eyes meeting his. For the first time, she felt the possibility of a different life, a life where she wasn't just a pawn, but a person who could choose her own path. The following days passed in a blur of unfamiliar routines. Elena found herself moving through the palace, her every step echoing in the vast, empty corridors. The palace was a maze of marble and gold, its grandeur overwhelming at times. But it wasn't the opulence that weighed on her mind. It was the uncertainty that hung in the air. Lucas had promised he wouldn't treat her as a pawn, and so far, he hadn't. But promises, especially in this world, often meant little. Elena couldn't shake the feeling that this was all a temporary reprieve, a brief moment of kindness before the system closed in on her again. Despite herself, she found herself watching Lucas more closely. His words had been sincere, but so were the words of many others who had deceived her in the past. The Alpha King was different from the men she had known, that much was clear. But was he truly capable of seeing her as more than an Omega, more than a tool to be used? One afternoon, Lucas invited her to join him for a walk in the palace gardens. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the manicured hedges and fountains. The air was cool and crisp, the kind of peaceful calm that Elena had longed for. They walked side by side, the distance between them filled with quiet contemplation. It's beautiful here, Elena said softly, her voice almost lost in the rustling of the trees. Lucas glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. It is, he agreed. But it's also empty. Elena raised an eyebrow, surprised. Empty, she repeated. How can something like this be empty? Lucas sighed, his eyes turning toward the horizon. Because it lacks purpose. There's no meaning to all of this if it's not shared with someone who understands it. That's what Luna was to me. She was the reason this place had meaning. Elena's heart ached at the mention of Luna. She had always known that the memory of Lucas's late wife haunted him, but hearing him speak of her so openly was something new. And now, she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Now, Lucas said, his voice steady. I don't know. I'm trying to find meaning. Again, to understand who I am without her. But it's not easy. Elena looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. There was a depth to his words, a vulnerability she hadn't expected. She had always seen him as a powerful, distant ruler, a man who had everything and wanted nothing. But now, she realized, he was just as lost as she was. They were both trying to find their way in a world that had never shown them kindness. You don't have to do it alone, Elena said softly, before she could stop herself. Lucas turned to her, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart race. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. And what about you? He asked, his voice low. What do you want, Elena? The question caught her off guard. What did she want? She had spent so long just surviving, just getting by. The idea of wanting something more, of choosing something for herself, felt foreign. I want. Elena hesitated, searching for the right words. I want to feel like I matter. Not because I'm an Omega, not because of the mark on my wrist, but because I'm me. Her voice trembled slightly, but she didn't look away. Lucas's gaze softened, and for the first time, Elena saw the man behind the crown. He wasn't just the ruler of a kingdom. He was a man who had loved and lost, a man who was trying to find his place in a world that didn't make room for him. You matter, Lucas said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. You matter to me. Elena's breath caught in her throat at the sincerity in his voice. She hadn't expected that, didn't know how to respond. Was it possible that Lucas Montgomery, the Alpha King, saw her as more than just a tool, more than just a reminder of his past? She didn't know, but for the first time, she allowed herself to hope. Maybe there was a place for her in this world after all. Maybe there was a future that wasn't defined by the chains of her past. And maybe, just maybe, she could find it with him. Days turned into weeks, and Elena slowly began to settle into her new life at the palace. The initial tension that had surrounded her arrival began to fade, replaced by a quiet, tentative understanding between her and Lucas. There were still moments of silence, moments where Elena couldn't quite shake the feeling that this arrangement was fragile, a fleeting moment that could shatter at any time. But, as time went on, she started to realize that perhaps, just perhaps, she had more control over her life than she had once believed. Lucas had kept his word. He didn't treat her as a mere object or tool for his personal gain. There were no demands, no expectations placed on her beyond the simple request for her company, her thoughts, and her presence. And while there were still moments of doubt, moments when Elena wondered if she was truly free, there was also a growing sense of something else, trust. It wasn't a trust that came easily. After everything she had been through, it was difficult to believe in anyone or anything. But with Lucas, something about the way he treated her, the way he listened to her when she spoke, began to chip away at the walls she had built around herself. One evening, after dinner, Lucas invited her to join him on the balcony. The night was cool, and the stars were scattered across the sky like diamonds. Elena stood beside him, her gaze drawn upward as she took in the sight. She had never really paid attention to the stars before. They had always seemed so distant, so irrelevant to her own life. But now, standing here beside Lucas, she found herself lost in the beauty of them. Do you ever wonder, Lucas said, breaking the silence, how small we really are in the grand scheme of things? Elena turned to look at him, surprised by the question. She hadn't expected him to speak of such things. What do you mean? She asked. Lucas took a deep breath, his eyes focused on the stars. I mean, when you look at the world, at everything that's happening in it, it's easy to think that we matter, that our actions have meaning. But sometimes, I wonder if we're just small parts of something much bigger, something we can't even begin to understand. Elena considered his words carefully. It was strange, hearing such vulnerability from him. The Alpha King, the man who had everything, had power, had control, was now admitting to something she had felt for so long. The feeling of being insignificant, of being lost. Maybe, Elena said quietly. But even the smallest part of something can have meaning. Lucas turned to face her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. You're right, he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it before. Perhaps even the smallest parts can make a difference. The conversation lingered between them, but there was a shift in the air, a sense that something important had just passed between them. For the first time, Elena felt like she wasn't just a part of a system. she was an individual. Her life, her thoughts, her choices, they mattered. And maybe, just maybe, she could help Lucas find a way to matter, too. It was a quiet, almost imperceptible change, but it was there. A shift in the way they saw each other, in the way they saw the world around them. Elena didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if she would ever truly be free from the weight of her past. But standing here, on the balcony, under the vast sky, she realized that for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel so alone. And perhaps that was enough. The days passed quietly, but the peace between Elena and Lucas was fragile. She found herself walking through the palace with a sense of hesitation. Each room she entered reminding her of the boundaries she still couldn't cross. Despite his kindness, despite the promises, there was still an invisible wall between them, one that neither of them dared to approach too closely. It was a wall built by their pasts, by the roles they had been born into, and by the weight of expectations that loomed over them both. Elena had learned to survive in a world that saw her as nothing more than an object, a tool. But with Lucas, she felt something new, something frightening. She felt like a person, and the more she realized that, the more she feared it might all be temporary, just a fleeting moment before reality closed in again. Lucas, for his part, had been patient, understanding in ways she hadn't expected. He never pushed her, never tried to force her into a mold she didn't fit. But the question remained, what did he want from her? What was she supposed to be in his world? The more Elena thought about it, the more uncertain she became. One evening, after dinner, Lucas invited her to his study. The room was lit by the soft glow of candlelight, and bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes on history, politics, and philosophy. The air smelled faintly of old paper and ink, a scent Elena had come to associate with Lucas's quiet, introspective nature. She sat across from him at his desk, her hands folded in her lap as she waited for him to speak. "Elena," Lucas began, his voice soft but firm, "I need to ask you something." She looked up, meeting his gaze, her heart skipping a beat. "What is it? What do you want?" Lucas asked, his words hanging in the air between them. "I've given you space. I've let you make your own choices. But now, I need to know what you want from me, from this life we're building together." His words were direct, but there was an underlying vulnerability in his tone, something Elena hadn't expected. It was the kind of question that made her heart race. What did she want? The truth was, she wasn't sure. For so long, she had been taught that her desires didn't matter, that her life was not hers to control. She had never been allowed the luxury of making choices for herself. But now, standing here, in this room with Lucas, she realized that her answer could be different. She could choose. "I want to matter," Elena said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to be seen as more than just an omega, more than just a tool. I want to be seen as a person. I want to have a voice, to make a difference, not just in your life, but in my own." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that she hadn't expected. It was as if, in saying them aloud, she was finally allowing herself to exist as more than just a survivor. She was allowing herself to dream. Lucas was silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. He studied her with an intensity that made Elena feel exposed, as if he could see every part of her soul laid bare before him. Finally, he spoke. "You already matter, Elena. More than you know." His voice was low, almost a whisper, as if the words were something precious that he didn't want to lose. "You matter to me." The sincerity in his voice took Elena by surprise. She had never heard him speak like that before, and for a moment, she felt her heart swell with something she couldn't name. Was it hope? Was it trust? Or was it something even deeper? She didn't know, but for the first time, she allowed herself to feel it. She allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had a place in this world, not because of the past she carried, but because of the person she was becoming. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but it was heavy with the weight of what had just been said. Elena could feel the shift in the air, the change in the way they saw each other. And for the first time, she felt that this fragile peace they had built, this delicate understanding, might actually be real. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to her future than she had ever dared to imagine. The days that followed felt different. There was a subtle shift in the air, a sense that something was changing between Elena and Lucas, though neither of them spoke about it directly. It wasn't as if everything had become perfect overnight, But there was a quiet understanding, a recognition that they were both learning to navigate this new path together. Elena had never felt this way before, like she was not just surviving, but actually living. For the first time in her life, she felt like she could make choices, like she wasn't just a piece in someone else's game. The feeling was foreign and exhilarating, yet terrifying all at once. One afternoon, as they walked through the palace gardens, Lucas stopped beside a rosebush, his hand lightly brushing the petals. "Do you ever wonder," he asked, "what it would have been like if things had been different? If Luna had lived?" Elena turned to him, surprised by the question. She had never asked herself that before. "I think about it sometimes," she replied carefully. "But it's not something I dwell on. Life is the way it is." Lucas nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "I never wanted to replace her. I still carry her memory with me every day, but I'm learning that I can't let it define everything." Elena watched him carefully, sensing the depth of his words. For so long, he had been bound by his past, by the image of Luna that loomed over him. Now, she saw a man who was trying to free himself from that shadow. "I understand," Elena said softly. "We all have something that shapes us, something we carry. But it doesn't have to control us." Lucas's eyes met hers, and for a moment, Elena saw something in them she hadn't expected: vulnerability. He was no longer the untouchable ruler she had first encountered. "I'm not sure how to move forward," he confessed, his voice quieter now. "But with you, Elena, I feel like maybe there's a chance." Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just the weight of his words, but the sincerity in them that made her realize how much he had changed. Lucas wasn't just offering her a place in his world. He was allowing himself to find a place in hers. The thought both comforted and frightened her. She had spent so long hiding behind walls, refusing to let anyone close, fearing that if she did, they would see her as nothing more than an omega, a tool. But with Lucas, there was something different. He saw her, not for what she had been made to be, but for who she was. Elena took a deep breath, stepping closer to him. "I don't have all the answers either," she said, her voice steady. "But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to see what happens if we both let go of the past." Lucas reached out, his hand brushing hers, and for the first time, it wasn't just an act of comfort. It was a promise. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice soft but resolute. Elena looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, she felt like she was not alone. In that moment, it wasn't about the past or the roles they had been given in life. It was about the future, about what they could build together if they dared to. She wasn't just a pawn in someone else's game anymore. She was a person, with choices, with a voice. And as they stood together, facing the uncertain road ahead, Elena realized that, perhaps for the first time in her life, she had the power to choose her own destiny.